All right, let's talk about those legal requirements now. Just like everything else, pay policies are subject to laws and regulations. One example is that two competing businesses cannot conspire to set wages. So, for example, if there were two bicycle companies, I had one and Joe has another one, Joe and I cannot get together and decide how much we are going to pay and that we won't pay more than the other. Restaurants can't do it. It is against the law to have a agreement that this is what we're going to pay people. Here are some other laws that we always have to keep in mind when we are talking about pay. So equal employment opportunity, the EEO laws that we've talked about over and over, obviously are going to impact pay. Minimum wage, which was established by the Fair Labor Standards Act. Overtime, child labor, prevailing wages, and pay ratio reporting. So we're going to walk through each of these. Equal opportunity employment. You guys have heard about it over and over in this course at this point. I hope you are pretty clear on what it means, but just to restate it, pay cannot be different because of age, sex, race, or any other protected status. Differences in pay should be based on their qualifications for the job, their job responsibilities, their job performance. Those are the reasons why we pay people differently, not because they're a man or because of their race or because of their religion or any of those things. The goal is to provide equal pay for equal work. That's the whole point of an equal employment opportunity law. And we use things like the job analysis that created a job description and our job structure and our pay structure, so that if we are challenged in court to say you are discriminating based on something, you have a lot of stuff to say. Here's how we make our pay decisions. It's always important to note when we talk about pay that there are general big picture pay inequities. Women earn 81 cents for every dollar earned by men, which is significantly better than it was when I came into the job market and 10 years ago. Black male employees earn 75 cents for every dollar earned by white men. Hispanic men earn 70 cents. Black women earn 85 cents. Hispanic women 78 cents. So you can see when we look at based on race, based on gender, there is disparity. However, you have to consider what we talked about earlier when we talked about the glass ceiling in terms of employee development. The glass ceiling is a whole lot of factors that impact opportunities for bigger jobs and career advancement, which is very related to pay. There are also lots of other factors that impact how people are paid. So keep in mind, EEO laws do not guarantee equal pay for any groups. They don't say from now on men and women will always be paid the same, or whites and minorities or different religious groups, they're always going to be paid the same amount. What they do say, like I said before, equal pay for equal work. And the philosophy is, so you may be saying, well, you said in the last video that if Joe had 20 years of experience and Mary was brand new, that you would pay Joe more, and that's not equal pay for equal work. But philosophically, the idea is that if Joe has 20 years of experience, the work he is doing is not equal. He is able to do things, make decisions, solve problems, understand things that an entry-level employee isn't able to do. Therefore, their work is not exactly equal, even in the same job. So that is how it gets a little fuzzy, I think, if you're thinking, well, Joe and Mary are doing the exact same job and you're paying Joe more. But I'm paying Joe more for these things that allow him to do his work slightly differently because he's got 20 years experience. Or whatever it is, he's been with the company longer, so he understands our policies. But all of those things should result in slightly different work that we are paying for. All right, minimum wage is established by the federal government. The Some states actually, you cannot go below what the federal government establishes. Federal government establishes a baseline, and then some states go out and say, we still don't think this is enough based on the cost of living here in our state. We think it needs to be higher. And so they establish a higher level. Like I said, you can't go lower, but if you want to establish a higher minimum wage in your state, states are able to do that. An employer has to pay whatever is the highest. You can't say, I'm going to go start my bicycle company in California where the minimum wage is higher than the federal minimum wage, but I'm just going to pay federal. You have to pay whatever's higher. Minimum wage tends to be lower, the federal minimum wage, than what's required just to rise above basic poverty. So when you are thinking about job structures and employee retention and employee engagement, that's just a factor to keep in mind, that if you have people who are responsible for themselves, these aren't, high school students who are living with their parents, but these are adults who have to pay a mortgage or rent and buy food and maybe feed a child, a minimum wage job is not sufficient to do that for the way today is. All right, overtime pay is required for any time someone works more than 40 hours in a week. And overtime pay is set at 1.5 times their regularly hourly rate. So for the sake of making it an easy discussion, if you make $10 an hour, your overtime rate is 1.5 times. So 10 and half of 10 is 5. So it'd be $15 an hour for overtime. The thing about overtime to remember as an HR person or as a manager, overtime applies even if the employer did not request that employee to work over 40 hours. So if you just didn't schedule properly and someone stays longer than 40 hours, if you were short-staffed and you let someone stay and keep working because you needed someone there and that pushed them over 40 hours, you are then required to pay 1.5 times their hourly rate, whether you said, hey, I need you to work overtime. That doesn't matter. What matters is they did work overtime, therefore they must be paid for overtime. Even if the employee volunteers and says like, oh, do you want me to stay longer? If you say yes and they work more than 40 hours, you now need to pay them overtime. The thing about overtime, there are 2 different categories of employees. FSLA is the legislation that established this, and it says there are people who are exempt from getting overtime. That means they don't get paid overtime. They're exempt from it. So that's how you remember which is which. People who are exempt from overtime are people who are paid salaries. So if I say, you make $40,000 a year, you're a salaried employee, you are exempt from overtime. Typically, salaried employees are white-collar jobs, administrative, managers, executives, professionals, accountants, engineers, things like that. So exempt, you do not get overtime. Non-exempt are hourly employees that are paid by the hour, and they are all covered by FSLA requirements for overtime pay. So people in a restaurant, people doing a lot of hourly jobs. There are a lot of hourly paid jobs, and in those cases you are required to receive overtime for anything over 40 hours a week. FSLA also addresses the use of child labor for anyone who is younger than 18 years old. So anyone younger than 18, there are different, and it is staggered depending on how much younger than 18. So 16 and 17 have pretty broad latitude in where they can work, except in hazardous occupations like mining, heavy machinery, working around hazardous chemicals, anything like that that seems hazardous. A 16 or 17-year-old is not able to be employed in those occupations. Now when you get to 14 and 15-year-olds, There are much fewer opportunities for a 14 or a 15-year-old to work, mainly because the theory is that they are still going to school the majority of the time, and so they can only work outside of school hours. You cannot hire a 14 or a 15-year-old to work, from 9 to 5, because they're supposed to be in school. And they have a limit on how many hours they can work. They can't work a full 40-hour work week like someone older can because they're younger. And when you get down to 14-year-olds, a 14-year-old can only work in a non-hazardous job for a business entirely owned by that child's parent or guardian. So this kind of allows people who have family businesses and the whole family pitches in and works on the family business. This is the law that allows that to happen, but that's really the only case when someone 14 or younger can work and be paid. Now, there are some very, very old laws from around the time of the Great Depression that govern pay policies for federal contractors. So think about, I don't know if you remember the Great Depression, lots and lots and lots of people were out of work. The federal government stepped up and tried to create lots of programs to help people just have jobs. It's when they started building the interstates, for example, so that people could have working, have jobs and get paid, and this country now has an interstate system because of it. So it was a win-win, but they did establish laws that said any federal contractor, like those contractors that were building the interstate system, they had to pay their employees rates equal to the prevailing wages in the area. So this was back then, as I said, Great Depression. People were desperate for work. What could have happened is federal contractors could have said, hey, we got this big lucrative contract to build an interstate. We're going to pay people, next to nothing because they're desperate and they need work. And what these laws said was actually you have to pay them at least what the wage of the area is, so they hopefully are making some minimum standard of living where they can afford to live and eat wherever you're building the interstate or doing whatever you're doing. That law still stays in place today. Now, this is a law that you guys, it's from your lifetime. Hopefully you remember some of this. If you remember the Great Recession around 2009, when our country had a big the mortgage bubble burst and lots of banks, this was when the whole too big to fail thing people were talking about, where the banks were going under and the federal government had to bail out a lot of the big banks because they were too big to let fail. It would have destroyed the economy. And so the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010 was in response to all of that stuff that was happening in the world. Just like those other laws were in response to what was happening in the economy, these are a response to what was happening in the economy in around 2009, 2010. One of the things they looked at, and if you don't understand this, there's a good movie called The Big Short. Go watch The Big Short. It does a good job of explaining kind of what was happening in the market that caused this Great Recession. But anyway, so in 2010, one thing that kind of came out as all of these banks are starting to fail and we're seeing some big problems with the economy that could have been very, very serious. People started looking at how much CEOs were being paid in these big companies. And so Dodd-Frank, one of the requirements of Dodd-Frank, there are very, very many, but one that you need to know about as someone who's thinking about HR and pay structures, is that public companies in the United States are required to include the ratio of a CEO's pay to the pay of a typical worker. Does he make 10 times more than a typical worker in the company? Does he make 100 times more? Does he make 1,000 times more? This is required to be reported in a financial statement. This is not a law that says you can't pay more. Any company has the discretion to pay what they want, but they did require that people are very transparent and everyone knows it, including stockholders, including just the average employee. They know how much the CEO is paid compared to a median employee in the company is paid. Okay, so those are the laws. We've walked through EEO, minimum wage, overtime pay, child labor, prevailing wages, that you have to pay prevailing wages based on those laws, and the pay ratio reporting. So in the next video, we're going to talk about market forces. So stay tuned for that.